and the Crane. Once upon a time, in a swamp, there lived a heron and a crane. They didn't live together. The heron had built her scrappy nest on a dry mound at one end of the swamp, and the crane had built his, which looked very the same at the other end. One day, as the crane was standing, gazing at himself in the shallow, muddy water, it occurred to him that he was rather lonely. He scratched his right leg with his left foot for a while and said to himself, "It's high time I got married, but who could be his wife?" It didn't take long to decide on the heron, because she was the only unmarried bird who was roughly the same shape and size as he was. There was some elderly lady ducks, but they were out of question. And so, after grooming himself very carefully, the crane stepped gracefully through the still water until he came to the other end of the swamp where the heron lived. "Good morning, heron," said the crane, feeling a little embarrassed because he still hadn't quite decided how to put his suggestion. "Good morning, crane," said the heron, who had no idea why he was visiting. "Won't you come in?" She would have invited him to sit down. There wouldn't have been room for all the legs. "Will you marry me?" asked the crane suddenly. He had meant to lead up to this suggestion rather gradually, but in his excitement, he couldn't think of anything else to say. The heron was very taken aback. She just wasn't prepared for such a question. She lost her head and cried, "Marry you? Goodness gracious, what a ridiculous idea. Just look at you, you're all legs and neck, and those awful knobbly knees." The crane was very hurt by this outburst. He cast a sad look at his knees. They were rather bony. "And what's more, you just couldn't keep me in fish." She shouted this so loudly that he knew it was time to go. Without a backward glance, he turned and made his way slowly through the swamp to his own nest at the other end. When he had disappeared from view, the heron thought it over. She was very unhappy about the way she'd behaved. "I've been very unkind to insult him like that," she said. "And as for the fish, well, I'm perfectly capable of catching my own." So she decided to go and apologise and offer the crane offered to marry him after all. She left the nest and picked her way gracefully through the swamp water, hanging down her head very cowily as she approached the crane. He was standing rather sulkily with his back to her, but it was obvious that he had heard her coming. "Crane," she called softly. He didn't answer. "Crane," she called, "I've come to apologise. I didn't really mean all those nasty things I said, and I take them all back." He didn't move. "Crane, it would make me very happy to become your wife." On hearing this, the crane turned around and gave her a stony glare. "Thank you very much for your kind offer," he said, "but as you previously remarked, I don't want an extra beak to feed. I'm sorry, but marriage between us is out of the question." There was a moment of complete silence over the swamp before the heron burst into floods of tears and hurried off back to her own nest. When she was out of sight, the crane thought it over himself and suddenly felt very miserable. "Why was I so cruel?" he said. "I want to marry her, and now I've hurt her feelings. There's nothing for it. I shall just have to go and apologise for my behaviour." He really did feel very ashamed of himself, and to make up for it, he caught a juicy frog which he carried dangling by one leg from his beak. He stepped hastily through the swamp and stopped a little way from the heron's nest. He was so agitated that the frog was quivering. "Heron," he mumbled nervously, "I'm sorry for what I said a little while ago, and I brought you. The heron didn't give him time to finish. Her pride had been wounded, and now she was quite a temper. "I don't want your pity, you brute," she screeched. "I know your sort. I'd rather remain alone until the end of my days than marry someone as hard-hearted as you." This wasn't the welcome the crane had hoped for. His beak half opened in dismay, and the frog fell and plop into the wet mud. "This is the end then," he thought to himself, and turned to make his way back to the other end of the swamp. When he had gone, the heron said to herself, "How sad he looked. I'm afraid I punished him too severely. I do want to marry him, and What if he should do something terrible? Why, he may even throw himself into the swamp and drown. This was not really likely, as the swamped water was nowhere more than ankle deep, and the crane was rather a large bird. But the idea was enough to terrify the heron. She almost ran to the other end of the swamp to reassure herself that the crane was still alive. When she arrived, she gasped breathlessly. "Oh, Crane, thank goodness you're safe. Please say you forgive me for The crane interrupted her. "Oh, I've seen these moods of yours before. 1 minute you're meek as a water vole, and the next you're screeching your head off at me. No, thank you, I'm..." And before he could finish, she had turned and walked away, back to her own nest at the other end of the swamp. There really is no need to tell you that the crane very soon thought things over, but of course the heron wouldn't listen to him. And so they went on, day in, day out, backwards and forwards from one end of the swamp to the other. And if you happen to go there, you'll probably find them still at it. Do you think they'll ever make their minds up?